They applauded when I cleared the debt that would have closed the doors forever. 3 months later, I was escorted out by security, while the chairman's cousin took my chair. Please stay with me for a moment. Listen carefully, not for drama, but for the quiet truth in what follows. Some stories are not shouted, they are lived. My name is Daniel Mercer, and for 12 years I worked for a mid-sized manufacturing firm just outside Coventry. It wasn't glamorous work. We made specialist fittings for public transport, brackets, housings, things most people never noticed unless they failed. I like that. There was honesty in being useful without being visible. I grew up in a terrace house with thin walls and parents who taught me that keeping your word mattered more than keeping your pride. I carried that into work. I was the sort who arrived early, stayed late, and didn't talk much about it. I believed effort spoke for itself. By the time I reached my early 40s, I was head of operations. Not a board member, not a director, but the one people came to when things were stuck. I knew the suppliers by first name, understood the machines by sound, and could read a balance sheet well enough to spot trouble months before it showed on paper. And trouble came. A bad overseas contract, a sudden rise in materials costs, and a careless expansion plan pushed by the board nearly broke us. By winter, the numbers were brutal. Wages were at risk. The bank was circling. Redundancy letters were drafted but not yet sent. The chairman, Martin Hale, called an emergency meeting. He had the sort of confidence that came from never being contradicted at home or work. Tall, always polished, always speaking as if time itself owed him respect. "We need solutions," he said, tapping the table. "Not excuses." I went home that night and didn't sleep. Instead, I opened my laptop and worked. I restructured supplier agreements, renegotiated payment terms, and found inefficiencies we'd been ignoring for years. I called favors. I swallowed pride. I asked people for patience. For weeks, I lived on instant coffee and quiet hope. When I presented the recovery plan, the room was silent. The finance director asked questions. The bank approved an extension. The redundancies were paused. Slowly, painfully, the company stood back up. People thanked me in corridors. Some brought biscuits to my desk. One of the lads from the shop floor shook my hand with both of his. Martin Hale sent a single email. "Good work. This buys us time." That was all. Not long after, Martin's cousin arrived. Oliver Hale was younger, charming in a careless way, and openly proud of his surname. He'd done a bit of consulting and was brought in as a strategic advisor. No one explained what that meant. He had a new office before he had a clear role. At first, I tried to help him settle. I walked him through systems, introduced him to department heads, explained the fragile balance we were still maintaining. He smiled, nodded, and then began undoing things. Meetings were called without me. Decisions were made without data. When I raised concerns, Oliver laughed lightly and said, "You worry too much, Dan. This isn't the shop floor." In front of others, he'd correct me even when I was right. He'd repeat my ideas as his own 5 minutes later. Once, during a presentation, he interrupted me mid-sentence. "Let's not get lost in detail," he said. "Daniel's very thorough." People laughed politely. I felt my face burn. I went to Martin. I asked calmly for clarity, for boundaries. Martin leaned back in his chair and smiled in a way that wasn't kind. "You've done well here," he said, "but you need to learn your place. Oliver's family. He sees the bigger picture." I left his office with my chest tight and my thoughts loud. 12 years reduced to a lesson in hierarchy. The emails began to change tone. My authority quietly eroded. Staff were told to check with Oliver first. Desi. Scions I'd made were questioned openly. Once in a meeting, Oliver said, "We're moving on from Daniel's old ways." Old ways, as if survival itself was outdated. The worst moment came on a Friday afternoon. An all-staff email announced a new leadership structure. Oliver was now director of operations. My role was not mentioned. By Monday, my access to certain systems was gone. HR asked me to have a quick chat. They spoke gently, but their words were rehearsed. "Your position is being made redundant." I sat there nodding as if watching someone else's life. As I packed my desk, Oliver passed by. He didn't stop. He didn't look at me. Someone else did that for him. Security. Outside, the air was cold and ordinary. People walked past with shopping bags, with plans, with no idea that something essential had just been taken from me. I stood there for a long time, holding a box of papers and a quiet, breaking heart, and somewhere deep inside, beneath the hurt and the shame, something else stirred. Not anger, not revenge, just the knowledge that life has a way of remembering how we treat those who stand quietly beside us when things fall apart. Losing the job wasn't the sharpest pain. It was the silence that followed. On the Monday after I was let go, I woke at 6 out of habit. The house was still, the sort of stillness that feels heavier when you haven't earned it. I made tea, sat at the kitchen table, and stared at the wall where my work calendar used to hang. My wife Eleanor watched me quietly from the doorway. She didn't rush to reassure me. She knew I needed space to understand what had happened. At first, I told myself it was temporary. I updated my CV, reached out to contacts, and sent applications late into the night. Coventry wasn't short of factories, but senior operational roles were few, and word traveled faster than people admitted. A couple of recruiters were polite but vague. One said carefully, "They mentioned you were resistant to new leadership." Resistant? I'd nearly lost the company trying to save it. The days blurred into each other. I took long walks through the estate, past identical houses and clipped hedges. I nodded at neighbors who still left for work in the mornings. I started timing my trips to the shops so I wouldn't meet anyone who might ask how things were going. Eleanor went back to her part-time job at the library earlier than planned. She said she liked the routine. I knew she was worried about money, about the mortgage, about me. But she never once said it out loud. Meanwhile, from a distance, I watched the company I'd given years to drift into something familiar. Former colleagues would message me quietly. Not calls, messages, always apologetic. "Hope you're all right. Things are different now. Meetings feel strange without you." One of the supervisors, Alan, rang me after a few weeks. He sounded tired. "Oliver's changing suppliers again," he said. "Cheaper ones overseas, quality's dropped already." I told him to document everything to protect himself. I heard my own voice sounding like it used to at work, steady, practical, still caring. When the call ended, I sat there with the phone in my hand, feeling both useful and useless at the same time. Inside the company, the tone had shifted. Oliver spoke loudly in meetings, dismissing concerns with humor that landed awkwardly. He brought in consultants who used long words and short visits. Processes that had taken years to refine were labeled legacy thinking. When something went wrong, he didn't listen. He deflected. "This is what happens when people cling to old systems," he said once, apparently referencing me by absence. Martin Hale backed him fully. In board updates, he praised Oliver's energy and fresh approach. When a minor contract was lost, Martin blamed operational inertia from the previous regime. I heard that line from someone else. It sat with me for days. The hardest part was the humiliation that lingered. Not loud, not dramatic, just persistent. I'd given everything quietly and been dismissed just as quietly, as if that made it acceptable. There were moments I questioned myself. Maybe I had been too cautious, too thorough. Maybe the world had moved on and I hadn't noticed. But then the cracks began to show. Deliveries were delayed. Customer complaints increased. A small but reliable client canceled their contract after repeated faults. Staff morale dipped. 2 experienced engineers left within a month. Oliver brushed it off. Short-term turbulence, he called it. At home, the pressure built. We canceled a weekend away we'd planned for Eleanor's birthday. I took on small consultancy jobs, nothing stable, just enough to slow the drain. Each rejection email chipped away at something inside me. One evening, while clearing old files, I found the original recovery plan I'd written, the one that saved the company. Notes in the margins, calculations, late-night logic. It felt like proof of something I was no longer allowed to be. I folded the papers carefully and put them back in the drawer. At the company, Oliver's confidence began to harden into something brittle. He pushed harder, spoke faster, and listened less. When a senior manager challenged him in a meeting, Oliver snapped, "If you don't like the direction, maybe you're not right for the future here." Martin laughed. Others didn't. The justification was always the same. Oliver believed he deserved his place, that blood and entitlement outweighed quiet labor, that those beneath him should accept it without question. And so the distance between who he was and the consequences of his actions grew smaller each day, even if he didn't yet see it. As for me, I learned how to endure without being seen. I learned how to hold my dignity when no one was watching. I didn't know then that this endurance would matter later, when the roles would begin to shift in ways none of us could predict. But something was moving, slowly and patiently, like a tide that doesn't announce itself until the shore has already changed. Change rarely arrives with noise. It settles in quietly, like dust you only notice when the light shifts. By early spring, I'd stopped checking my emails every 10 minutes. The rejections still came, but I'd learned to read them without feeling like they were written about my worth as a person. I focused on what I could control. I helped Eleanor more around the house. I cooked. I listened. We talked honestly about money, about fear, about the strange grief that comes with losing a part of your identity. One afternoon, I received a call from a man named Stephen Lowe. He'd worked for a regional transport authority I'd partnered with years earlier. "I hear you're between roles," he said gently. "Would you consider short-term advisory work? Nothing flashy, we just need someone steady." It wasn't a rescue. It was a lifeline. I accepted without hesitation. The work was part-time, contract-based, and mostly invisible. I helped untangle supplier issues, reviewed safety compliance, and advised quietly from the edges. No titles, no praise. Quietly. Not in protest. Just exhaustion. Years of loyalty dissolved into resignation letters written at kitchen tables, just like mine had been. One afternoon, Alan rang me again. He didn't try to hide how shaken he was. "They're asking for your documentation," he said. "Your old processes. They can't stabilize production." I felt a strange mix of sadness and relief. Sadness for the people still inside. Relief that the work I'd done had value, even if it took absence to reveal it. I sent what I could. Not out of obligation, but out of decency. Oliver, meanwhile, was struggling to maintain the image he'd built. His jokes fell flat. His charm turned brittle. In meetings, he interrupted more often, spoke louder, and dismissed concerns with an edge that unsettled people. Once, when a junior manager raised a legitimate safety issue, Oliver snapped, "If you can't handle pressure, this isn't the job for you." The room went quiet. People looked down at their notes. Martin began to feel it too. The bank called again. Contracts wavered. Shareholders asked questions he couldn't answer with confidence. At home, Eleanor noticed the shift in me before I did. "You're lighter," she said one evening as we washed up together. "Not happy exactly, but steadier." She was right. I wasn't winning. I was enduring. And in that endurance, something was aligning. Then the call came that changed the direction of everything. Stephen asked if I'd attend a meeting in Birmingham. The transport authority was considering a major consolidation of suppliers. My former company was one of them. "They're not performing well," he said. "We need an independent operational review, someone who understands the industry and isn't tied to internal politics." I understood immediately what he was asking. I took a long breath. "I can be objective," I said, and I meant it. The meeting was calm, professional, and thorough. I didn't criticize, I presented facts: delivery delays, quality failures, staff turnover, risk exposure. No names, just reality. A week later, the authority placed the contract under review. Inside the company, the mood darkened. Oliver began to feel cornered. Martin pressed him harder. Meetings stretched late into the evening, decisions were reversed, confidence gave way to defensiveness. For the first time, Oliver was being spoken to the way he'd spoken to others: cut, off, questioned, undermined. He didn't recognize it at first. He thought it was stress, bad luck, external pressure. But those around him did. They'd lived in that space before. And they knew what it felt like to be dismissed when you were trying your best to hold things together. As for me, I sat at my kitchen table, reviewing documents for the next advisory meeting, aware that the balance was shifting, not through force, not through revenge, just through time, consequence, and the quiet persistence of truth. The turning point didn't arrive with an apology or a confession. It came, as most things do, through necessity. By summer, the company was no longer in denial. The bank tightened its terms, the transport authority suspended new orders, cash flow thinned to a trickle. Martin Hale's confidence, once unshakable, began to fracture in public. Emergency meetings became routine, consultants came and went. Each one cost money the company didn't have. And then, reluctantly, Martin made a decision he'd spent months avoiding. They needed an interim operations lead. Someone experienced. Someone trusted by external partners. Someone like me. The call came from HR first, polite, careful, almost apologetic. "We're exploring options," the woman said. "Your name has come up." I didn't respond immediately. I asked for time. That evening, Eleanor and I sat in the garden as the light faded. We talked about pride, about boundaries, about whether returning would reopen wounds we'd only just begun to heal. "You don't owe them anything," she said softly. I knew that. But I also knew something else. Returning wouldn't be about proving myself. It would be about seeing things clearly, without bitterness. I agreed, on one condition. I would report directly to the board as an external interim advisor. No operational authority under Oliver. Full transparency, they accepted. They had little choice. Walking back into the building felt strange. Familiar, but altered. People greeted me with cautious relief. Some smiled genuinely. Others avoided my eyes, unsure how to behave. Oliver wasn't at the first meeting. When he did arrive late, he froze for a moment when he saw me. "Daniel," he said, forcing a smile. "Didn't expect to see you." I returned the smile, calm, neutral. Neither did I. From that point on, the shift was unmistakable. I asked questions Oliver couldn't answer, not aggressively, just thoroughly. I requested reports that hadn't been maintained. I highlighted risks without assigning blame. The board listened. They leaned forward when I spoke. They asked follow-up questions. Oliver began to interrupt, as he always had. But this time, Martin raised a hand. "Let Daniel finish." It was a small moment, but it landed heavily. In the weeks that followed, Oliver's authority thinned. Staff began bringing issues to me quietly. Not because I asked them to, but because they trusted consistency over noise. Oliver noticed. He grew tense, defensive. In one meeting, he laughed sharply and said, "We're not going backwards just because someone's nostalgic." I met his eyes. "This isn't about the past," I said evenly. "It's about stability." The room stayed silent. No one laughed. Outside the meeting room, I overheard Oliver speaking to HR, his voice low and urgent. "They're undermining me," he said. "This is exactly what Daniel used to do, make people doubt leadership." The irony was not lost on me, but I said nothing. As the review progressed, the board made a difficult decision. Oliver would remain, but his role would be redefined. Strategic input only. No operational control. The announcement was made carefully, diplomatically. Oliver sat still as it was read out, his face pale, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. Afterwards, he lingered by the window while others left. I gathered my papers quietly. As I passed him, he spoke. "They're treating me like I don't matter," he said, not looking at me. I paused, not out of triumph, but recognition. "I know," I said. He turned then, his expression unreadable. For the first time, there was no confidence in his eyes, just confusion, and something like fear. In the following days, Oliver experienced what he'd once inflicted without thought. People interrupted him. Decisions he'd made were questioned openly. His emails went unanswered. His suggestions were noted, then quietly ignored. Martin, under pressure, grew distant. The easy familiarity between uncle and nephew faded. Blood ties weakened under financial strain. And Oliver, once elevated without effort, found himself standing on uncertain ground, looking up at the very systems he dismissed. As for me, I worked steadily. I didn't gloat. I didn't correct him publicly. I simply did the job I'd always done, calmly, thoroughly, with respect for the people doing the work. The reversal was not dramatic. It was subtle, almost painful to watch. And it wasn't finished yet. The full weight of change arrived not in a meeting, but in a quiet corridor outside the boardroom. The company had stabilized just enough to breathe again. New suppliers were being vetted properly. Trust, fragile but present, had begun to return. It wasn't a victory. It was survival. And everyone knew how close they'd come to losing everything. Oliver no longer sat at the head of the table. He wasn't asked to present. When he spoke, it was often after the key decisions had already been made. One afternoon, I arrived early for a review session and found him alone, standing by the notice board, reading a printed memo. His shoulders were slumped in a way I'd never seen before. "They've taken my office," he said without turning around. "Said they need the space." I nodded slowly. That happens sometimes. He laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Funny, isn't it, how quickly things change?" I said nothing. There was nothing to add that wouldn't sound like judgment. The real moment came later that week. A junior analyst presented a report highlighting several failures from the previous quarter. Oliver had overseen those decisions. As she spoke, Oliver tried to explain himself, his voice tight. "We didn't have all the information at the time," he said. The analyst hesitated, then continued. She wasn't cruel, she was factual. But the effect was the same. When she finished, Martin looked at Oliver and said, "We'll need to be more careful moving forward." That was it, no defense, no reassurance. Oliver nodded slowly, his face burning in the same way mine once had. After the meeting, he approached me near the lift. "They don't listen to me anymore," he said. "I try to help, but it's like I'm invisible." I looked at him then, properly. He looked tired, smaller somehow. "It's hard," I said carefully, "when trust goes." He swallowed. I thought I was doing the right thing. I didn't correct him. The realization was his to carry. In the weeks that followed, Oliver's position diminished further. He was excluded from key discussions. Eventually, HR spoke to him about mutual options, consultancy, transition. The final humiliation came quietly. At a company briefing, a new interim structure was announced. My role was extended. Oliver's was not mentioned at all. People clapped politely. Oliver stared at the floor. Afterwards, as people filtered out, he remained seated. I waited until the room was nearly empty before approaching. "I never meant to push you out," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I thought it was how things worked. I thought of the day security walked me out, of the laughter, of being told to know my place. "I know," I said, and I meant it. "That's what makes it hurt." He nodded slowly, tears welling but not falling. There was no apology that could rewrite the past, no punishment that would balance it perfectly, just the quiet weight of understanding. Not long after, Oliver left the company. There was no announcement, no farewell email, just an empty desk and a name removed from the directory. I didn't celebrate. I didn't feel victorious. I felt something softer, sadder, the kind of sadness that comes when you realize how easily people mistake power for worth. The karma wasn't loud. It didn't shout or shame. It simply placed Oliver where he had once placed me, uncertain, unheard, and learning too late how it feels to be dismissed. And that, somehow, was enough. Life didn't return to how it was before. It never does. It moved forward, quietly, carrying the weight of what had been learned. I stayed on as an interim advisor longer than expected. Not because I wanted the title, but because the people needed steadiness. When things finally settled, a permanent operations director was appointed from within. Someone capable, someone who listened. I stepped back without ceremony. On my last day, I cleared my desk slowly. There was no escort this time. Just handshakes, nods, and a few words that didn't need to be long. Alan walked me to the door. "You did right by us," he said. I smiled. "So did you." Outside, the air felt lighter than it had the day I'd left with a cardboard box. Not because everything was perfect, but because nothing had been taken from me this time. I was leaving whole. Oliver's name surfaced once more months later. Eleanor mentioned she'd seen him working at a consultancy firm in another city. A junior role. No fanfare. I pictured him there, learning again how to wait his turn, how to speak and not be heard, how to feel the quiet weight of being overlooked, not as punishment but as experience. I hoped he'd grown from it. I truly did. At home, life found a new rhythm. I continued advisory work, carefully choosing where my energy went. Eleanor and I took the postponed trip, walking along the coast with no urgency, just presence. Sometimes, late in the evening, I'd think, back to that moment outside the building, holding my box, feeling small and forgotten. I realized then that I hadn't been forgotten at all. I'd simply been ahead of the lesson. Not everyone who hurts others does so out of cruelty. Some do it out of ignorance, out of entitlement they've never questioned. But life has a way of teaching gently, then firmly, then unmistakably. The roles reverse, the voices change, the silence speaks, and when it does, the only thing that matters is who you were when no one was watching. If this story stayed with you, take a moment. Reflect. Share it with someone who might need it. Leave a comment, a thought, or simply carry it forward in how you treat the next person who stands quietly beside you. Because the way we treat others never disappears, it only waits for the right moment to return.